But I wanted to start this morning with a story that I know you've probably heard before, but it's really one of those kind of foundational stories for Redemption Church. It sort of tells us a bit about who we are. And it's about one of my heroes, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Any other Bonhoeffer fans in the crowd? Okay, you would all raise your hand if you had heard this story. So let me just tell you the story. Bonhoeffer was a youth pastor and church official or leader in Germany in the 1930s and 40s during the rise of National Socialism. And he came from, the Bonhoeffer family was this prominent, successful German family. His father was really the leading psychiatrist of the day in all of Germany. And his mother was the daughter of a Prussian countess. She was like nobility. And the granddaughter of this really famous theologian, Karl von Hayes, who's a big deal. And she raised these 8 extraordinary children. You can see them there on the right. If you don't know, Dietrich is the one. I think the next slide has a arrow pointing to him. And you can see he's clearly upset about his haircut. That was bad. The things we do to children, right? But they were raised in this kind of extraordinary family by a mother who just filled their house with art and music and literature and prayer. And all of the children grew up to be very accomplished. His older brother, Karl, was a physicist who was on the first team to split the atom. And another brother, Bonhoeffer, was a lawyer who argued routinely before the German Supreme Court. Just like a real bunch of slackers, the Bonhoeffers were. And Dietrich, was raised to be successful like the others. And so when he told them his plan was to study theology and join the clergy, they couldn't understand why he wanted to waste his life like that, which I try not to take personally, but come on. And so he went to school and got his PhD in theology and did some scholarly work in teaching, but you couldn't be ordained until you were old enough. He was only 24. And so he applied for this thing called the Sloan Fellowship, and this brought him to the U.S. and Union Theological Seminary in New York City for a year. And Bonhoeffer, when he got here, he had kind of an interesting reaction to the American church. He didn't get it. He thought theologically his peers were just lightweights. He's like, come on, dig in a little deeper here. And culturally, he was very bothered by the disparity between the rich and the poor, and especially the segregation among races. And the way that the Christians just seemed okay with this. It really bothered him. And his theory was that the American kind of mythos told us that the pilgrims, had come to America fleeing religious persecution so that they would be free to worship any way that they please. And he said this had convinced American Christians that it was actually possible to follow Jesus without suffering, which he saw as a mistake. He met this fellow student, a guy named Jean Lasserre, who was a Frenchman at Union. And they became fast friends, and Lasserre taught him about nonviolence and the centrality of the Sermon on the Mount for Christian discipleship. And Bonhoeffer, when he found a church, he joined a black church, Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. He ended up teaching Sunday school there, which always cracks me up when I picture this blonde-haired, Aryan German teaching Sunday school in a black church. But they embraced him, right? And so he kind of got a taste of the underside of American culture. And his time here really it changed him as a follower of Christ. He ended up being more radical, more active. And then at the end of his year, he heads back to Germany, just energized by what he had encountered, and then was blindsided by what he found when he showed up there. Germany, had a state church, the German Lutheran Church. And he arrived home to find out that Hitler's people had infiltrated leadership within the German church. And it was quickly becoming just a de facto arm of the Third Reich. And he was crushed, He had given up everything to join the clergy and serve the church. And now the church was capitulating to the Nazis. But at the same time, he had this family tradition of leadership and of principle, and so he began to fight back against the German Christians. In 1933, they adopted something called the Arian Paragraph, which said that all clergy or officials in the church who were of German descent, they just had to have it somewhere in their background, they were immediately removed from their post, essentially defrocked as pastors. And Bonhoeffer and his friends fought against this, but to no avail. The church just began embracing Hitler's move and his anti-Semitism. In fact, at one time, more than 20,000 German pastors voted to remove the Old Testament from the Bible because it was too Jewish. Can you imagine? And he fought against this. In fact, just 2 days after Hitler became chancellor, Bonhoeffer gave this famous radio address on German public radio, calling out the Nazi party, naming Hitler as a false leader. And the story goes, the SS showed up in the middle of the broadcast and cut off the mic. And eventually he decided he could no longer be part of a church that bowed to Hitler. And he signed something called the Barmen Declaration. Quite a few of them did. This is a picture right outside of a bunch of the clergy who had gathered to sign it together. And it just proclaimed, Christ is the head of the church, not the Fuhrer, not some leader. And of course, for signing this, he and his friends were driven out of their positions of leadership. And so they started a different synod in the Lutheran language, a new kind of church split. They started something they called the Confessing Church, which became this subversive underground church in Germany. And Bonhoeffer was tapped to run their seminary and train their pastors. And it's interesting that one of his best friends, Eberhard Bethke, says that he had brought back from America a stack of black gospel records that he had bought. And they played it all the time. It was like jazz. And this became the soundtrack of the German resistance, the Christian resistance to Hitler, which I think is just perfect. But the Gestapo, of course, threatened he and his friends, intimidated him, eventually shut down the seminary, and it looked like he was going to prison when his friends from Union Theological Seminary got involved, and they arranged for a student visa. And his church friends snuck him out through Switzerland, then to the UK, and then across to America to wait out the war. And he would later call this his 40 days in the wilderness. He was completely alone in New York City, isolated from his family and friends who were all back in Germany, just getting pounded by the Nazis, paying this incredible price. And he was miserable and alone in New York City. Kept hearing of colleagues being rounded up by the Gestapo, sent to concentration camps. Two of his sisters had married Christian men of Jewish descent who would later be killed. And he was smuggled to America. Like, his job was to just survive the war and return to help rebuild the church. But he was miserable and sick with worry because everyone he loved was in deep, deep trouble. And he felt like he'd abandoned them. And he writes these really tortured journal entries during that time. I want to read one of the last ones he wrote in his short time in America. He's only here about 30 days that time. He said, "I have had the time to think and pray about my situation and that of my nation, and to have God's will for me clarified. I have come to the conclusion that I have made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the people of Germany. I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. My brothers in the Confessing Synod wanted me to go. They may have been right in urging me to do so, but I was wrong in going. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying that civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose." He's going to work for the defeat of his nation. But he said, "I cannot make that choice in security." So he sailed for home under this conviction that there's no way to follow after God from a place of safety and security. So he returned home, immediately joined the Abwehr, the resistance to the Nazi Party, and 4 years later, he was killed by the SS. And one of the things that I take from Bonhoeffer's life is this idea that there's no way to work for the kingdom of God, and especially work for justice, without some kind of vulnerability emerging. Or as I've heard it said, the flourishing of the vulnerable depends upon the vulnerability of the flourishing. Those who are doing well have to live in solidarity with the least and the last and the lowly. And this means leveraging our status and power, our voice, our resources, risking even our own reputation to challenge those in power who run the systems that crush people who struggle.